Okay, welcome to the Huntington Botanical Gardens plant sale nursery propagation table. Today we're going to focus on how we actually manipulate cuttings, what we do to take asexual cuttings and how we choose those cuttings, and also how to set up a flat and kind of go through the entire process of cutting selection, sticking, and placement. Okay, so first things first, rather than drag you guys along with me to the cutting process to actually get these, I'm gonna kind of skip ahead. Reason being is that just time constraints, and we have a whole nother lecture, an exciting lecture on plant propagation, and we're gonna kind of go through how we typically select cuttings for asexual propagation. But we're going to go through it, somewhat quickly today, but we'll get more into the nitty-gritty later on in the semester. So basically, one of the first things that I'm going to do when I select my cuttings is select a plant material that's going to make sense for sales, that's going to have some sort of ornamental, edible, or some other appeal to the public. Also, I'm going to make sure that when I'm selecting plant material to take asexual propagules from, that plant material is nice and healthy, right? If I see instance of disease or predation by pests, I'm going to really scrutinize that plant material because I don't want to infect the other flats that are on my table, right? So I'm going to make sure that these are all plants that are stock plants here in our nursery, and I'm going to make sure that the health of those stock plants is always at peak optimal health because I want to make sure that I'm in constant asexual production here at the sale nursery. So one of the things that I'm looking for when I'm selecting cuttings, again, I'm going to spray my little pruners in between each plant material, so not in between each cutting, but I'm just going to do due diligence with my isopropyl alcohol, 70%. I'm going to sanitize the blades of these propagation scissors. These are really great scissors, actually. These are made by ARS. It's a Japanese company, and a lot of times they're used for bonsai, but they're also really great for asexual propagation. For one, they don't have a spring in the center of this swing, and that's really nice for negating carpal tunnel syndrome. It lets you ease your way through the cuttings without the tension of the spring that normal clippers have, right? And also they have these big wide handlebars on them, and it's really great because you can actually manipulate plant material and still hold these in your hands, so you have a very fluid ease of movement throughout the propagation process. All right, one of the things I do when I'm selecting cutting material is I'm going to make sure that it has a good bend to it. And what I mean by that is that it's flexible enough that it still bends. And this is for semi-hardwood cuttings, right? Or even softer cuttings, this is fine. So I'm going to make sure that it has a nice bend to it. But I don't want it to be so sappy that it's already starting to wilt, right? So I want it to have some turgidity in that stem because that's very important. Once we've severed the root system from this plant material, it really needs a helping hand in order to maintain turgidity, right? So I always like to take the tip cuttings. In commercial production, you would probably use multiple cuttings from this stem, and we're going to do that today. But the tip cutting is always the best looking cutting because it looks like just a little seedling. And so what I'm going to do is have my cuttings about the width of my palm, so about 4 to 6 inches is pretty standard. And then you're going to make it look like a little tree. So you're going to leave some of that foliage on, and you're going to take some of the foliage off of that basal stem of the plant. Once I do that and I've processed that cutting, I make sure to put it in a little basket. This basket is just filled with some water so that I can continue to keep that cutting turgid throughout the cutting process. I want to make sure that our little plant here, this is Jasminium parkeri, a very cool little tiny jasmine with beautiful yellow fragrant flowers. really nice as a potted specimen or cascading over a wall. I'm going to make sure that this label makes it with that plant. Very important, especially if you're processing plant material that looks very similar to one another. Oftentimes here at the Huntington we have entire areas of a particular garden that are all salvias or something like that, and so I'll take the opportunity to take the cuttings of all the salvias, but very important that we are managing them by keeping them separate from one another, right? And so as you can see with this water basket, not only do I have my individual tags with my plants that I'm processing, but also I have individual little 4-inch containers in here that are going to contain separate plant material. So also from this plant, I can take another cutting here, strip off those lower branches, maybe tip back some of those little shoots, and again I'm just creating these little trees. If you were really excited about this plant but you didn't have a lot of propagation material, one of the really cool things that you can do is actually take some of the side shoots. So you can actually take branches off of the side and create cuttings with those as well. This is somewhat different when we're talking about plant material like conifers that have really orthotropic shoots that have really dominant apical meristems, meaning that they want to grow up, right? They want to grow upright. If we were to disrupt that upright growth, oftentimes you can see when they top pines or whatnot, they never retain that apical conical shape, right? Same thing with cuttings. If I were to take cuttings of a conifer from the side shoots, that plant for the rest of its life would continue to travel horizontally, right? It would never maintain that apical meristem. And so it's really important that for those types of plants, if you are taking cuttings, that you want to take them from shoots that are shooting straight up, that are apical. All right, the next plant we have is Salvia jade carpet. Salvia jade carpet is a really cool plant. It's a Salvia melissodora hybrid that has been introduced by Tree of Life Nursery. So of course we had to get and snag one of those and put it in our stock plant garden so that we could propagate it for our plant sales. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that label makes it in the basket, and I'm going to take the different individual shoots of this salvia out of the bucket of water that they're staying in to keep them nice and turgid, and I'm going to evaluate this cutting. Already I can see that, especially with salvias, when they get this beautiful pink blush on them, that is a prime signal to me that this plant is ready to be propagated. I don't know the physiology behind that, but I know that when I propagate salvias that have that beautiful pink blush on them, they root very quickly and they grow a very vigorous root system. So I can already see here with this little guy that, one, we have flower buds, and what do we want to do with flower buds? We want to prune them off, right? We want this plant to focus on rooting rather than shooting and bud and flower development. But even if this didn't have any buds, we can see here that it's very bendy and it's also drooping, right? So this is losing its turgidity because this is very fleshy material on the stem. If we were to cut open this stem, we could see that a lot of ooze comes out of that stem, right? That is an indication that the stem is not lignified enough yet in order to take a cutting and be able to withstand the warm, wet conditions of a cutting bench. Oftentimes really soft, sappy material will just rot away. And so we want to make sure that we tip that out. I see a few flower buds here, so I want to make sure to take those off. And then these have some pretty nice long internodes, so I'm just going to cut about 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch below the next set of leaves, below that node. And then this would make a perfectly good salvia cutting. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in the basket. As we get lower down the stem, we're going to have harder wood material, and that's okay. Just expect that that harder wooded material is not going to leave a couple more leaves on this one, that it's not going to root as fast as maybe some of the other material that has more auxins or more rooting chemical or rooting hormone inside of the plant material. All right, like I said before, if we're collecting a lot of plants that are the same genus, then we want to make sure that we're being very diligent about keeping them separately. This next plant is Salvia pucella crossed with Involucrata. So this is a really cool species salvia. Many of the salvia is a big, broad genus of plant. It's a big group of plants, and many of them come from Mexico, so they do really well here in our arid, dry climate. We can see here these big, beautiful blooms just starting to open up their buds. You can also see probably why we picked this to be a stock plant here at the Plant Sale Nursery. But we are going to have to, unfortunately, prune out that bud so that we can refocus the plant's energy and hormonal balance on the actual rooting process of the cutting. So I'm going to go ahead and tip out that bloom. And again, I'm going to be taking off about 1/4 inch to 1/8 of an inch below the node of that stem. I'm going to take off those sets of leaves. I'm going to cut off some of the bigger leaves. Maybe I'll just take this one and reduce it in half. We want to leave, the reason we leave some leaves on, it's very important that some of these leaves are retained because, as you guys know, plants photosynthesize. And so in order for this plant to essentially feed itself once it does create a root system, it needs to have some leaf material in order to do that. Now, exceptions to that rule would be plants that we take cuttings of in their dormant state, like many deciduous trees. Grapevines, for instance, will actually take cuttings of those big stems in their dormant state, stick them, and then wait for them to both root and send out leaves almost simultaneously, right? Once the nights start to get a little bit warmer, about above 50 degrees, you'll start seeing that happen. All right. So again, my tag for my Salvia pucella Involucrata is going to go right in that basket with my salvia so as not to get them confused with one another. Cutting below the node, cutting out that big long stem that's sticking out. I'm going to tip back some of these leaves. I'm going to fold this big leaf in half. And the reason that we're actually cutting off some of the leaves is to reduce transpiration rates. There's a lot of water loss associated with processing asexual cutting, so it's really important that we're trying to minimize and reduce that water loss from the leaves in the vascular system of the plant. Once we get to the portion where we're actually placing our flat of cuttings, you guys are going to see some of the methodology and automation that go into the system that keeps these cuttings healthy, turgid, and warm throughout the rooting process. All right, so next you guys are going to see the process of actually putting the cuttings into the cutting flat. So I am going to be using a synthetic hormone product called Dip and Grow. Dip and Grow is a product that you can get straight from Amazon. Well, not right now, but in the future, right? So Dip and Grow is a really great product. It's a synthetic version of 2 different types of hormones that are naturally occurring in plants. But those naturally occurring hormones in plants have to be synthesized because they're photosensitive, meaning they break down with certain degrees of photons of light. And so we had to stabilize that solution in the industry, and we've created synthates of what actually naturally occurs in the plant material. All the plant material that we're going to be processing today is actually chock full of hormones, right? This is spring, so I mentioned before when we were talking about rose pruning that we kind of wait for the rose pruning. It coincides with the spring equinox, right? So the spring equinox typically happens around the 19th, 20th, or 21st of March, and it's dictated by warmer night temperatures, right? When we talk about an equinox, we're actually talking about how the planet sits in relation to the sun, right? And so it's a lot about how the length of days and nights as compared to one another. But there's also a different call out, if you will, of spring, right? So there's a meteorological call out of spring. So that's going to be usually dictated about the 1st of March, just because meteorologists like to kind of section things off into quarters so that it's easy to create statistical models as far as weather data is concerned. And so typically March 1st will be the meteorological start of spring, and that is dictated by warmer night temperatures that are above 50 degrees. And so that's between the 1st and the 20th is my window to start looking at plant material and assessing it for cutting value. So in the beginning of March, these plants were not ready yet. So only 28 days later, now they're finally ready. So they were very soft. It was still kind of cold outside. And so now next week, we're going to start seeing temperatures of 53 at night, 54 at night, 56 at night, 52 at night. And so those temperatures get the plant to start to harden off, lignify their stems, and so that makes a lot better, sturdier, stronger cutting material that's much less susceptible to rot. All right, so one of the first things that I'm going to do, again, it's always about my wantingness to keep the plant material with the label, right? That's very important because I don't want to mix these up. If in fact I do lose a label, or I mix up plant material and I recognize that mistake, then I have to basically throw the cuttings away or give them away free to a good home, because here at the Huntington we really need to make sure that what we're selling is what is dictated on the label, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is pull out my group of plants with the label, and the very first thing that I like to do is to stick the label right in the flat. When I am setting up a cutting flat or a potting flat of any kind, the way that I like to set it up is like you read a book in English. So my labels are going to go from top to bottom and from left to right, just like you would read the pages of a book, right? So I've got my rooting hormone. Now, the label for Dip and Grow says that you should stick the cut ends of the cuttings in the solution for 3 to 5 seconds. I've already talked to the manufacturer. There is no benefit from what they've tested of leaving your cuttings in there any longer. I know people do that because they think the plant is actually going to translocate more of that, or that's not the right word, kind of soak up by capillary action more of that material, when in fact 3 to 5 seconds is just enough for the plant material to grab onto some of that rooting hormone. So I just go ahead and count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I utilize this tool, which is a really great tool, but you can also use a pencil or a chopstick or anything that you have available, even your finger might do. But this is a dibber, and it just literally dibs a hole for my cuttings. So now I'm going to place my cutting in that hole, and I'm going to firm around the cutting. That part of the process is very important. So not only do you want to make the hole, and I'm not going down all the way to the bottom of the flat, just to where this dibber stands up on its own. Then I'm going to put the cutting into the flat and again firm that hole, that empty hole around the actual cutting. And the reason that I do that is because just like when you're planting a plant in the ground, we need really good root to soil material or substrate capture, right? So this material has to sit very close to that stem, and then when it starts to grow a root system, close to that root system, so that one, it's not sitting in a big pocket of air and dries out, and two, this media has to be close to the root system so that it can get water, right? So this is what holds the water, and the roots passively move that water through their root hairs up into the vascular system of the plant and out into the shoots, leaves, and buds of the plant material. So now that I've gone and stuck those 2 Jasminium parkeri, I'm just going to move straight on to my next plant. So next is going to be my Salvia Jade Carpet. Again, I'm going to set this flat up from top to bottom, left to right. So rather than just making another group of plant materials next to this, this is going to be the very next plant. So no matter where it falls in the flat, it's always going to be the very next. And this is just so we all are on the same page, right? People set their flats up differently. I think this makes the most sense, right? And it's easy to explain to volunteers and new employees. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm going to stick that in the hole. After I've dibbed it, dib a hole, stick my cutting in, firm around the cutting. All right, next group of salvia. Making sure that label goes right into that cutting flat. Very important. Dibbing the hole. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 seconds in the rooting hormone. And then sticking that straight into the cutting flat. Alrighty. And just to show you guys some of the materials that we use for propagation, I'm going to go ahead and bring the camera on over here. Alrighty. So here you can see that we have our rooting hormone, our flats, and these are the components that we use in order to make the media substrate that all of our plant material is going to be holed up in throughout the rooting process on the mist bench. So here we have perlites. So for a pony flat or a quarter flat like we're using, we're going to be using 2.5 scoops. I use this 1 gallon as my scooper, right? So any measurable container is fine. So 2.5 1 gallons of perlite. I use about a 1/4 cup of sand. This is washed river sand. Very important that it's washed river sand and not some of the sands that they use at, for sanding purposes and for building purposes. The next thing that I use is 1/2 tablespoon of this mycorrhizal powder. I've got it labeled on the top of that container. The mycorrhizal powder is kind of a magic potion solution. I'm not exactly convinced wholly that it is the source of all rooting for my cutting flats, but that being said, I've done a few anecdotal experiments and have noticed a difference between flats that have been inoculated with the mycorrhizal inoculant and flats that haven't been inoculated with the mycorrhizal inoculant. So I think that we're getting some promising results with that, but it could be wishful thinking, so we'll see. All right, so the very next thing that we're going to have to do is water this flat in. So I'm going to go ahead and take the flat, put it on this cart, and then it's very important that when we water in a flat that we are doing so thoroughly, right? Because we want to make sure that this flat is going to get watered from the very top of that substrate all the way down to the bottom of that substrate. So just like we showed with watering in that big 5-gallon rose, we want to make sure we're applying enough water to where that water can percolate throughout the entire volume of that flat. This is going to be the first and last time, theoretically, if the mist bench is working properly, the first and last time that we're actually going to have to apply water from a hose to this flat. And you'll see in just a moment the automated system that takes care of the cuttings after they're ready. Alrighty. So I'm going to make sure that my water is turned on to such a pressure that it's not going to mess up my cuttings. But you're going to see here in just a sec, I'm going to sweep through that whole cutting flat, going in opposite directions around the edges where it gets the very driest. And we can see here that that water is percolating through that flat, through the media, and out through the bottom weep holes of that flat. So that's really good that it's getting all the way through that media, because we want it to be nice and hydrated for this very important process of rooting. Alrighty. So we're going to go ahead and push our cart over to our propagation bench. And you guys get to see the back of our nursery. This is a work in progress here. We've got a lot of really cool little plants here. We would have had a lot of cool plants for our plant sale, but now we're saving them for the fall sale. So you can see that we're growing a lot of small groups of different varieties and cultivars and genuses of plant material. So there's a lot here that we're going to be selling in the months to come. So all of these plants have been propagated either by cuttings like we just did, or by seed. Alrighty. So we have already watered in our flat, which is great. Now the very last thing that we need to do is just place it right onto the mist bench. Alright, so you can see here that this little cutting flat has taken up a piece of real estate on these rubber mats. These rubber mats are heating mats. They're probably some of the best heating mats in the industry. They last for years and years and years and years. You can see these black lines. That's just some soil that's kind of attached itself to there, but these are the coils, the metal coils that are inside the flat, and they are run by a thermostat. When the thermostat detects a temperature under 72 degrees, these heating mats kick on and keep the media to a 72 degree temperature, which is optimal temperature for many species to root via cuttings. And so that's kind of why we keep it at that temperature. So you can see here that although we aren't having our plant sale, and that's so sad, the plants don't know that, right? And so we're going to make sure that we take advantage of this time and create a lot of beautiful plant material for future sales and future endeavors in the garden. So a little bit about how, oh, here we go. Here's some of the dormant wood cuttings I was talking about previously. So these are some grape cuttings. And you can see this is a mission grape, San Gabriel mission grape, one of the original grapes from the San Gabriel mission brought over by the friars. So very interesting. And we take these in a dormant state, right? So they just look like dead sticks of wood. And we put rooting hormone on them like we just did. I put them into these 1-gallon pots, and they sit here kind of in a dormant state until the night temperatures heat up a bit. And then they start to push roots. We'll go ahead and check and see. Let's see if I can. Let's look at another one that's rooted. Maybe it's a little bit easier to get out. There we go. How about this one? So you can see here that this grapevine, it has a really nice healthy root system. It's also just starting to push its buds. So a lot of this process is happening simultaneously, right? So it's got this root system, it's pushing its leaf buds now, and pretty soon it's going to be able to photosynthesize and feed itself. And so once I start to see leaf material coming out of these buds, that's my indication that it's time to take this plant, separate it from its mother pot, and propagate it into its own individual pot.